Losing and Salvaging the Past, the Destruction of Archaeological Heritage in the Middle East. Now, this is something, of course, that's very much in the headlines at the moment. Very much in the headlines at the moment because of what's going on in Syria and Iraq with the deliberate destruction by the so-called Islamic State of monuments and indeed the apparent bulldozing of entire sites. Just a few days ago you probably saw the photographs in the newspaper of some of the monumental statues in the museum at Mosul being deliberately smashed up with sledgehammers. It's the sort of thing that's been going on in the Middle East, particularly in those two countries, for a number of years now. You may recall that about 3 or 4 years ago in one of the rag magazines I published a photograph taken in Syria right at the beginning of the civil war, at a time when it was still relatively mild activity compared with what's happening today. But it was a photograph of tanks sitting beside some of the Roman remains in the city of Homs, the Roman city of Emesa in west central Syria. That now seems rather tame by comparison with what's going on. And the place that I'm going to put up simply as an illustration of what's happening in Syria in particular is this one here, Apamea. It's up in the northwest of Syria there. A major Roman city, about 250 hectares in size. So it was a big place by the standards of the ancient world. Most ancient cities, you're talking about maybe a quarter of that size for a sort of a fairly average city. This one's 250 hectares. And it's been the subject of extensive excavations by Belgian archaeologists for about 30 years. It was relatively well preserved already. There's a major street runs up here, and you can see the colonnaded part of it still well preserved. That was in 2011 in a Google Earth image. It's changed since then. That's 2011. That is in 2012. It looks like a moonscape now. There's the colonnaded street again. But otherwise, everywhere inside the city walls around here, that's why the limits are there of the digging. But somebody, or large numbers of people, have been in there digging all across the site. That's a particularly glaring example, but that was one that did the rounds about 18 months ago. Things have probably got worse since then, and I've been told about a whole range of other sites. And I'm simply thinking here of the sites of the Greco-Roman period that I have a particular interest in myself. But the same thing is happening all across Syria, and now increasingly in Iraq as well. The sites are simply being dug up by people they're not, unlike IS, which has seemingly been destroying things for their own sake, because they're idols, the statues in the museums. In the case of places like Apamea, people are digging there because their sources of income have dried up, and they're looking for things that they can dig up and sell on the antiquities market for however little. So, what they're finding is being torn out of context, so that even if archaeologists ever get a chance to go back to the site in the future, so many of the artifacts will have gone, and the context in which they once existed will have been damaged by all this excavation, all this digging. Shouldn't call it excavation. So that's a particularly glaring example, a rather unpleasant one. But what I'm going to be talking about today is not about what's happening in Syria and in Iraq, but a much more insidious destruction that's taking place and has been for at least 100 years now. Namely the everyday development that's taking place right across the Middle East, and the effects of people quite legitimately going about undertaking construction of roads, buildings, rebuilding their house, more houses being put up, and the effect that has on the archaeological heritage of the country. Now, I've chosen Jordan partly because it's the place that I know. I've been working there for over 30 years. But also because it's a marvellous example of a country that isn't at war. There isn't a civil war going on inside. It's not at war with any of its neighbours. And yet, probably more than its neighbours until the civil wars broke out recently in those neighbours, Jordan had suffered, its archaeological heritage had suffered much more than you would have expected. It's simply a factor of rising populations, as we'll see in a moment. Now, I put up this illustration from a book that came out in 1971, I think it was. It was a wake-up call in Britain to what was happening with the very rapid development that was taking place in Britain in the 1960s and early 70s. It was designed to catch people's attention very dramatically by having this great threatening red bulldozer with Stonehenge in the bucket. It wasn't about to happen, of course, but it was designed to sort of have people say, good grief, what's happening, that are all our great monuments in danger of being destroyed by development. And it led to the setting up of an organisation called Rescue, hence the title of the book, and it led to probably at least a quadrupling of the number of archaeologists being trained in universities and a number of university departments teaching it in order to cope with what was happening as a result of development in Britain, to make sure that sites weren't destroyed by new work being done in the cities and the creation of new motorways and so on. We've done something similar, trying to emulate what Rescue did by having the juxtaposition of another big red bulldozer here and Apamea that I showed you a moment ago in the background. It would have been better if I'd been able to put it on against the background of a site in Jordan, because it's really in Jordan that the problems exist and that I'm going to be talking about. The area that I'm particularly concerned with is down here. This is the northern part of Jordan. There's Philadelphia, the modern city of Amman, the capital of Jordan. So that's largely the area I'm going to be concerned with. And the driver for development in the region that I mentioned a moment ago is population growth. Now, there's a very high birth rate right throughout the Arab world, not just in Jordan. Life expectancy has increased dramatically. People have larger families. The sort of tailing off as people become more prosperous in the size of families they have hasn't happened in Jordan to any great extent. So there are large families, life expectancy is greater, and population has been rising very, very steeply. In the case of Jordan as well, it's become a dumping ground for refugees from its neighbours, from Palestine, from succession of wars from 1948 onwards, more recently from the two wars in Iraq, and to some extent still what's going on in Iraq. So much of it is unsettled or simply downright dangerous that people are either still moving to the neighbours into Jordan, or they're declining to go back home because it's still unsafe. And of course now we've got Syria with huge numbers of Syrian refugees in Jordan. On the news last night, it was announced that the third biggest city in Jordan now is one of the refugee camps, the new refugee camps for Syrians. This is the Zatari camp up near the border with Syria that you've probably seen on the nightly news. It's largely tents people are living in, but it's got schools, shops, all the facilities that people need to have for this huge concentration of people. And it's the third largest urban population in Jordan after Amman and Zarqa. There's a huge population bulge coming through as well. It's not just that there are a lot of people there now, but 55% of the population of Jordan is under 24. So there's going to be all these people having families and more children, more pressure on the landscape. Not just on the landscape and the resources, the necessary resources that people need out of it in terms of food and water, but the thing we're interested in here today is the archaeological landscape. What is happening to the archaeological sites with so many more people making demands on the landscape in which they live. And it's not spread evenly across the country either, because the greater part of Jordan is desert. It cannot be lived in with any comfort. There's only about 6% of it is officially arable, and that tends to be where everybody goes. It's where the bulk of the population was in the first place before all these refugees arrived, and it's where most refugees are sent to. If you look for where the refugee camps are, most of them are either in this arable area in the northwest where there's soils and water to help support them, or around the fringes of it. They have now built one of these refugee camps out in the desert near the Azraq Oasis, but that's because there's a major water source there. So huge numbers of additional people, and they're all going into essentially one corner of the country, and that's the corner where people have always wanted to live. It's where the great concentrations of archaeological sites are to be found, and with the deepest historical record. Population growth, what it actually means, we're going to talk about a steeper rise there than in its neighbours, much less in Western countries. In 1941, Transjordan was a British mandate. They did a census of sorts. Part of it had to end up being an estimate, but they came up with this figure of 330,000 people in what is today Jordan, was then still called Transjordan. So that's 1941, a third of a million people. July 2013, the population is now, according to recent censuses and some estimates, 6.48 million, and that was in July 2013. I see in July 2014 the estimate's been revised upwards by a cool 1.5 million since then, to 7.93 million. Let's just stick with the 6.48 since I've already done the arithmetic on that one. That's about 2,000% increase in population since 1941, when there was a third of a million. What does that actually mean? Well, Britain in that same period has seen a 20% increase, 1/100th of what Jordan has had. If Britain had had the same increase of population, 2,000%, its population today would not be 65 million, but it would be about 1 billion. In the case of the United States, the figures there would, the United States, instead of having 390 million people, would have 2.6 billion people. Now, of course, Jordan was starting at a very low base, so it's not a fair comparison, but it nevertheless gives you some idea of how, in 1941, Jordan was relatively thinly populated. The archaeological sites were still relatively well preserved. There was no great pressure on them. There was some, but no great pressure on them. But there's been this extraordinarily rapid change taking place since 1941, and you can start to see what that would actually mean in terms of the individual sites. Where is Jordan, and how does the Roman province of Arabia that I'm particularly concerned with fit into that? Well, there's Jordan there. It's probably a shape that you'd be familiar with, if only from the nightly news, when the Middle East seems to figure all too prominently. The Roman province of Arabia is roughly modern Jordan, plus a few additional bits. They didn't have this bit here along the east side of the River Jordan, but on the other hand, the Roman province of Arabia included the Negev desert, or most of it, and Sinai, and it also extended down into Saudi Arabia over here and parts of southern Syria. So, in crude terms, the Roman province of Arabia is modern Jordan. The Romans were there, or was part of the Roman world, for about 700 years, from 63 BC, when they first arrived and start to take control of parts of the region, right through until AD 636, so almost exactly 700 years. This is part of the Roman world, and to some extent it had been part of the Greek world for 200 years before that. So there's what the province of Arabia would look like, stretching down into Saudi Arabia, into the Hejaz over here, and also down the Wadi Saran into Saudi Arabia over there. That's gone wrong at the top here. Amman was part of the province of Arabia as well, as we'll see in a moment. And it's Amman that I'm primarily going to be concerned with, and in the region round about it. Amman is a large city, as we'll see in a moment, and it's grown very, very rapidly, far more rapidly even than the population of the country has grown. I was giving you the figures for the growth and population of Jordan. The growth and population of the city of Amman is even more steep. The region that we're concerned with is the city of Amman, sorry, not so much the city of Amman, but the hinterland of the city of Amman, what was going on in the territory of this classical city. So there's Amman there, Greek and Roman Philadelphia, and I'm concerned, in this book I've been writing for, seems like an eternity now, it's about 5 years I think, and it's still about 5 years to run by the sound of it. I'm concerned with what's going on in the territory of Philadelphia. It's territory stretching from the Great Wadi Mujib down here. It's one of these great natural features. It's a sort of mini version of the Grand Canyon. So stretching from the Wadi Mujib here up to the Wadi Zarqa over there. The Zarqa actually rises at the spring at Philadelphia, but then goes in a great loop before coming down into the River Jordan, and the Mujib flows out into the Dead Sea. It's a region that is one of the more fertile parts of Jordan, and it's called the Belka. So that's the area that I've been concerned with. Not so much what's happening inside the Greco-Roman city, what's happening to its remains, because they've tended to be quite well preserved, but what's happening outside the walls of the Greco-Roman city in its territory. So there's the two boundaries, north and south, and Philadelphia that I'm concerned with in the middle. The remains within the city itself, as I said, are quite well preserved. There's been extensive excavation taking place there for many years, and they're under no threat, or no particular threat. This is the citadel here. You won't get a proper impression, but it's very high with a valley here, another one running around there and up here. So this is very high ground, extensive excavation on the citadel, as you can see. There is also a theatre you've got the bottom part of it there, and an odium there, and the Roman Forum was in this area here. And there's a whole string of other buildings just off along here, but this is the heart of the city, around the Forum in the valley below the citadel. So this area is generally safe. There's unlikely to be much dramatic happening to it. Quite the reverse, it's preserved, it's a tourist attraction here, so they've got every incentive to maintain it. What I'm concerned with is what happens outside that. Now, the little area underneath the star in the middle there, that was the size of Amman in 1942. That little bit you can just see in there, it's tiny. The other area outside is, sorry, I thought it was going to come up. No, missed it. The other area outside is Amman as it is today. As you can see, that since 1942, the city has grown out in every direction. It's swallowed up some of the neighbouring towns, and I think there's just over 2.5 million people in the city now. So almost a third of the population of Jordan is in this one city, and there's been this huge sprawling out of the city since 1942, overwhelming the countryside and all of the archaeological sites in it. It's a little misleading as well, this map, because it suggests that everything in this area outside there is safe. Not at all. This whole area around the city of Amman has been transformed. Instead of being an area that was largely being used for wheat growing or stock raising, it's now very intensively become a sort of market garden. It's where fruit and vegetables are grown very intensively. So the whole landscape has changed very, very rapidly, very profoundly, and in the process, huge numbers of archaeological sites have been damaged or destroyed. And the whole area for miles around Amman is being populated with, gradually filled in with new houses, new villages, the existing villages doubling, trebling in size, towns merging into one another. So that without too much exaggeration, a Jordanian architect a couple of years ago told me that he didn't think there was going to be much longer, perhaps 10 or 15 years, before Amman had spread out to sort of swallow up Madaba down here, this big town down to the southwest. It sounded preposterous when he said it to me, but when you look at the map or you fly over this area now, as we do every year, you can see that this whole area is rapidly filling in with new houses and development. So the hinterland of the Roman city of Philadelphia, a large part of it already disappeared under this great sprawl of Amman itself, and as each year passes, more and more of the landscape beyond that is disappearing under new houses and roads and development as well. The circle that I've drawn on there is simply to represent the sort of area that people who were citizens of the Roman city of Philadelphia would probably regard as within their sort of everyday life, within about 20 Roman miles of the centre of the city. The Roman army was expected to march 20 miles a day for 2 days, then rest on the third. So people who live within about 20 miles of Philadelphia would regard it as a place that they could go to. Conversely, people who lived in the city would be reasonably familiar with the villages and farmsteads of the countryside round about, up to about 20 miles, in very crude terms. Despite the sprawl of the city, you can still regularly come across fragments of the Roman city in the suburbs or just outside the walls, so that we've got these monumental tombs at the top there. There's a whole string of them along this outcrop. Here's a mausoleum here, and a near vertical view down on top of a church that had been excavated a few years ago. What's misleading about this picture, or all three of these pictures, is that if you were to see these in the slightly wider context, if the camera sort of gone out a little bit, you'd find that the whole area around about all of these is packed with houses now. They're little islands in the middle of great housing schemes or surrounded by freeways. This one is perched on top of a hill where half of the hill has been completely cut away for a 6-lane highway to go through to take people down to the airport. So it's just sort of stuck there on the top of this hill now. You don't get that impression from the photograph. This one, the first time I saw it in 1976, it was beside a dirt track as we drove from Amman to Zarqa. Now there's again a 6-lane highway goes past, and there's houses for as far as you can see on both sides. So The pictures are misleading, but there are still fragments of Roman Amman that you can see there today. The change began to come at the beginning of the 20th century. It's traditional to sort of take 1918, 1919, when it ceased to be part of the Ottoman Empire and became a British mandate. It's traditional to take that as a turning point. The country begins to develop. It's usually suggested a little bit unfairly at that point. But certainly things have been moving very rapidly since about 1918, 1919. This is the western suburbs of Amman. The city itself is about 1.5 to 2 miles in that direction. When I first went to Amman, I stayed at the British Institute that was there, and you drove out along this road. There was just a few houses on the hillside round about. It's rather disturbing to think that just within my lifetime alone, this whole place has so dramatically changed that all the hills round about where this old British Institute used to be are now being covered in houses. And as you can see, there's great ring roads, highways all the way around the place. It's got a marvellous road system. This is what one archaeologist in the 1930s, this American Nelson Glick, had to say about it. He points out that in the region round about Amman, where I've taken this image from Google Earth, he says that already modern villages are beginning to grow up on top of the ancient ones, that the archaeological remains are still relatively well preserved, but things are going to change quite rapidly. So he ends by saying most of the ancient sites remain unoccupied in modern times, but that's the 1930s. Within a few years, it's starting to change very rapidly. Things have gone even faster since 1948. This is the Deputy Director of the Department of Antiquities of Jordan, Fawzi Zaidin, writing in 1981, saying that archaeological discoveries have been stimulated during the last 2 years by the urban and agricultural development in Amman and its environs, which prompted many salvage excavations. The responsibilities faced by the Department of Antiquities became so heavy that it was decided to give priority to the endangered sites and that foreign archaeological institutions should help in the rescue operations. In other words, by about 1980, the Jordanians themselves were aware that the city was expanding so rapidly that the agricultural practices were changing and being so damaging that they couldn't cope themselves, and they were going to have to call upon the French, the British, the Americans, the Germans, all the countries that had archaeological institutes in Jordan to come and help them. They did, but they couldn't cope either. It requires huge sums of money, and the pace of change was just too rapid. That's about he's writing in 1981. Things accelerated since then, even more. There are more refugees, there's more of a drift into the urban areas from the poorer villages and towns of the country as a whole. The use of the land in the immediate vicinity of Amman has been changing. There's a lot of light industrial work going on there, market gardening, very intensive tilling of the soil, and a lot more new suburbs springing up, villages that were 4 or 5 miles outside the city. Within a few years you find that they've sort of grown and they've become part of the city. Every new motorway that's put in is a stimulus to people building alongside it. As soon as the new road goes in, the new motorway goes in, you can see the hillsides being laid out for new houses to go up so as that people can get down onto the motorway and get into the city or wherever they want to go very rapidly. So the motorways both take some of the pressure off Amman itself, but also stimulate its growth. Major developments, I'd said before that while it's traditional to take the First World War as a turning point, things had in fact begun to change in the last few years of the Ottoman Empire, not least by the building of the Hejaz Railway. It was initiated in 1900. It was designed to carry pilgrims from Damascus to Mecca, and once that happened, instead of huge numbers of people undertaking a very slow, laborious journey on foot or on camel or horseback from Damascus to Mecca, that would take 2 to 3 weeks, they could now do the journey in about 48 hours by train. And that had the effect of transforming Jordan in particular, as people suddenly realized that alongside the railways, you could actually make a living. You're selling things at the stations to the pilgrims. So change begins to come in the last years of the Ottoman Empire, even if the really big changes come under British rule. And the sort of shrinking of the country by the appearance now of airplanes as well, that made it so much easier to get around, and of course cars, trucks and so on. So a lot has happened. You've got the picture, so to speak, from what I've just been saying. What can we do to try and salvage things. I mean, how do we know what is there, what needs salvaged? How can we rescue it before it disappears? We can start by seeing what early travellers had to say. Western travellers visited what they frequently referred to as east of Jordan throughout the 19th century and up until the First World War. It seems to have been an invariable feature of all these travellers that they would sit down for a couple of hours in the evening and write their diaries up, their journals, and then it looks like just about every other one of them, when they got back home, was persuaded by family to have it published. You know, they all begin by saying, you know, that I hadn't intended to publish this, but you know, family and friends have twisted my arm, and you know, here it is. So we got literally dozens of these accounts of people travelling through this landscape, and they were often interested in what they saw there. They weren't just going to the major sites or travelling for its own sake. Some of them were adventurers. Some of them were motivated by what we would call tourism. Others were driven by their religious beliefs. They wanted to see bits of the Holy Land, to visit the places that they were familiar with from the Bible. You know, so a variety of motives, and they often wrote at enormous length and described what they were seeing as they travelled. Now, most of them only really stop to describe the same places again and again. They'll describe the ruins of Amman and Philadelphia and a Jerash and one or two other major places. Others, however, give you a very detailed account of what they saw as they were travelling along the roads, that they would say that there's a ruin on my right, 1.5 miles from so-and-so. Our guide told us its name is, and they would write down its name, and they would try to tell you something about it. So they're often extremely useful for giving you information on what they were seeing at the roadsides, about places that have now been damaged and in many cases completely destroyed. They've disappeared under houses, roads, or whatever. So the only record we have of them is what these travellers told us. The first of these travellers was this German, Ulrich Seetzen. He was there in 1806, and he says all this country, now bear in mind what I said before about population, that in 1941 the British thought population was 1/3 Seetzen is writing 140 years before that, when the population was almost certainly much smaller still. So he's talking about a landscape in which the only people you would see normally were Bedouin. There was only one reasonably sizable town, the town of Salt, which was the first capital of Jordan before it became Amman. And this is what Seetzen said as he travels through this part of Jordan. All this country, formerly so populous, he's basing that on the huge numbers of ruins that he sees, formerly so populous and flourishing, is now changed into a vast desert in which there is only one inhabited town called Salt. The whole country between Salt and Karak, that's the great Crusader castle halfway down Jordan, is uninhabited. Towns and villages are in a state of total ruin. So he sees everywhere that there are ruins of towns and villages, but there are no people. And he has a lot to say about the towns and village ruins that he sees. Many others followed after Seetzen, and as I say, they tended to publish what they saw. The ones who are important, however, are not so much the adventurers like Seetzen, and some of those who followed him realizing that he'd already said it. They didn't feel the need to repeat the same kinds of things. The ones who were particularly interested are the ones who had an academic inclination to provide their motivation, and who were much more systematic in what they chose to record. I picked out just a few of them to illustrate that there are quite a number of these 19th century surveys undertaken by people who were going there quite deliberately to systematically record the archaeological remains. They weren't just there for travelling for its own sake. To some extent, they might have been motivated by their religious beliefs, but that was not their primary motivation. They were there explicitly to record what they saw. The first of these was sent out by the newly founded Palestine Exploration Fund that came into existence in 1865 and is about to celebrate its 150th anniversary. They sent out an expedition in 1867 under a lieutenant of the Royal Engineers called Charles Warren. And a good soldier that he was, he did not only a sterling work in recording things and mapping as he went round, he then published it very quickly. So we've got quite an extensive account from about a month that he spent travelling east of Jordan. He's followed in 1881 by another expedition sent out by the Palestine Exploration Fund under another officer of the Royal Engineers, Claude Condor, who'd been working on the other side of the Jordan in what they simply called Western Palestine. They'd already produced 8 volumes for Western Palestine of what they'd seen and mapped there. And now, in 1881, they crossed the River Jordan and they began, or they thought they were about to begin, a total survey of Eastern Palestine. In fact, only one volume was to appear. The expedition that they undertook in 1881 was the only season. But it's a marvellous account, and it was followed by Brunov and von Domaszewski, two Germans. In fact, neither was a German, despite their names and despite the fact they wrote in German. Two very interesting men. They were there in these 3 years, 1895, 97 and 98, and they in turn produced three massive volumes of what they'd seen. By this stage, certainly beginning already with Warren, people were able to take photographs. You know. The first photographs we have of east of Jordan date back to 1844, when the technique had only really just been invented. But Warren already takes a few dozen photographs. Condor takes even more. And Brunov and von Domaszewski took hundreds as they went round, and they published almost every one of them. Then we've got the Princeton University expedition to Syria in 1904-05 and 1909. They too took huge numbers of photographs, made drawings, very detailed accounts of what they saw. And then there's Nelson and Glick in the 1920s and 30s. So we got at least four major 19th century surveys, plus this fifth one from the 1920s, in which people were systematically recording what was there, most of it being recorded before the great changes began to take place after the First World War. So these are the starting point for trying to salvage anything about what was once in this landscape, as you start by mining the written sources, the travellers, but in particular these people who were explicitly looking at the archaeological sites. As I mentioned, they began to take photographs of the sites and of themselves. This is a nice posed photograph with Charles Warren. He's a captain by this time. He was promoted while he was on expedition in the east. He'd been seconded from the army to the Palestine Exploration Fund. There he is there. He went on to get a knighthood and to be a general. He was one of the generals commanding a division in the Boer War, where his immediate superior described him as, quote, a complete duffer, unquote. But there seems to have been a lot of that around in the Boer War, so you shouldn't perhaps take it at face value. Where they were working, the conditions were extremely difficult. You know, these people frequently report in their accounts of illness to themselves, to members of their team, having to send members of the team back to Jerusalem to recuperate. Warden, Condor, both were eventually invalided back to Britain before they'd finished their work. When Warden was there in 1867, he went again to the eastern side of Jordan, to the east of the Dead Sea in 1868, and he took with him a British couple who were travelling in the region at the time, and the wife of this British couple died while they were east of Jordan. It was impossible to do anything for her, even to remove her body, so she was initially simply buried on a hillside east of the Dead Sea, although she's now, her remains were about 20 years later removed to Jerusalem and are to be seen there on a nice epitaph. There's a nice epitaph on her grave in the Protestant cemetery in Jerusalem. Tremendous health hazards and even resulting in death in a number of cases. So, you know, the work these people were doing was important, but it was also extremely demanding. So we've got Warren, that was the expedition of 1867. Condor's survey of 1881 was larger, longer, much more systematic. So I suddenly thought that was mine. Yeah, but Condor publishes this large book and large numbers of photographs and drawings, and above all, he publishes a very carefully prepared map which was based on triangulation. Almost everybody who'd been there before and had produced maps had done it by using compasses to say that X appears to be, you know, so many miles in such a direction, and that's how they'd work out what the map was. So that they tend to be very crude with lots of mistakes. But Condor's expedition, they had already mapped all of Western Palestine, and they had triangulation points that could be seen once they got east of the river. So they set up this great network of triangulation points on the east of the river, and they produced this marvellous map on the basis of it. I won't put it up because it's so dense, you know, that I'll put up sections of it in a moment to show you just how good it is. Amman is in here. Sorry, I can't quite see it, but this is as far east as they got. It's a point that we'll come to just in a moment. So they didn't map everything east of Jordan, not all of the Belka, but quite a substantial area. I think they themselves claimed that they'd mapped very systematically about 400 square miles. So it's an impressive undertaking. And the reason that I put that particular triangulation point on as the furthest place they got to is that, rather sadly, if they'd just gone a few more meters, 600 meters further east, they would have encountered a site that we discovered this year quite by chance. We discovered it by chance, although it's been there for 2,000 years. He got as far as this point that he calls Ras El Merkeb. This is a bit of his map there that I've blown up. And the site that I'm concerned with is just off in the white area. It's white because they didn't do any surveying there, but it is just a little bit further to the east. This is what was found by accident by us this year, flying over this area, and you can see that they'd been quarrying in the hillside, and there appeared to be abandoned stones in the quarry. There's more up on top there as well, and some just over there, the other side of the ridge. In close-up, they'd been quarrying columns, probably for the city of Amman, which is about 8 or 9 kilometers to the west. Until now, it's been thought that all the quarries from which the Roman city of Philadelphia was built were cut out of the hills in which the city itself exists. But now we've got this evidence from several miles to the east of the city that they were quarrying there. They'd cut out columns, a number of them, and they got broken, so they simply abandoned them and moved on. So that's what we see today. There's a close-up when we went out to visit on the ground of one that they'd roughed out. I think it's about 2 meters long, the scale there. And across the road we found another one that we hadn't seen from there initially, with even bigger column drums still abandoned in it. That's about a meter tall, so you can see that this column drum was probably about 2 meters in diameter, so intended for some pretty substantial building. The reason I put it on is not to brag about something that we found this year. I mean, I wasn't even there when they found it. I hadn't arrived yet, unfortunately. But because it fits in well with what I'm talking about, the threat to these sites. We've now got this first example of a quarry from which the city of Philadelphia was built. Prior to this, we thought that they'd simply been swallowed up by the modern city of Amman, but now we've got the specific evidence that they were quarrying much further away as well. That's where it is, and you can see that Amman is spreading out rapidly. It's arrived just to the north, and new houses still being built. Even worse is this here, modern quarrying. The modern city of Amman also requires stone. They dig it out of the hillsides, they pulverize it, and they make it into nice, convenient blocks for building the city from. And it's a local ordinance that all of the city must be made from stone of the same particular color. It's a very attractive color. It's a pretty city. But the quarry is heading north. The city is moving south. The Roman quarries in the middle are going to disappear. There's what the quarry to the south looks like, and to give you an idea of scale, there's buildings and there's some trucks and people down here. Huge area. This whole landscape is being torn apart. It's quite possible there were other Roman quarries there that have already gone. Certainly the one that we've just found may well be gone within a couple of years. And as you can see in the background, the town is on its way as well. The Roman quarries have been caught in this pincer. What I'm particularly concerned with in looking at the landscape around Amman is the evidence for villages. About 20 years ago, Fergus Miller, who at the time was Professor of Ancient History Roman History at Oxford, wrote a big book called The Roman Near East, in which he stressed that archaeologists and historians traditionally have focused on the cities. The classical world was an urban world. It's the cities we're interested in and what went on in the cities. But he says that we have to remember that probably at least 90% of the population didn't live in the city. They lived in the villages outside the cities. And that if you want to understand the nature of the ancient world, you have to study not just the cities that are essentially atypical. They're hugely important at first, but they're atypical of where people live. You've got to study the villages as well. So he says that really we should think of the Near East as being a world of villages, not just a world of cities. He uses the phrase at least 10 times in his book. He evidently thought it was rather important. And he stresses that not only do most people live in villages, but if you travelled around in the ancient world, although ancient travellers frequently only tell you about the cities that they were stopping in each night, they would have been passing village after village after village as they went along, rather like the modern travellers in the 19th century going through landscapes filled with ruined villages. What do these places look like? What do these villages look like in the vicinity of Philadelphia? Well, as you can see from the pictures I've shown you already, the evidence has been disappearing very rapidly for many years, and the process of attempting to record it simply can't keep pace with the pace of development and destruction. There are a few places where you can get hints as to what these villages look like. For various, usually accidental reasons, some of the villages have survived. This is one that's about 10 kilometres north of the Forum in Philadelphia. It's a place called Yadjuz, and because of land ownership roundabout, most of the ancient town, I'm not sure whether it's a village or a town, it's quite a large place, it's about 20 hectares, so it's either a very large village or a small town. Most of it has survived in this area there. You can see where excavation has taken place. When travellers passed by there 100 years ago, they frequently referred to the fact that you could see there was column drums lying round about, but they thought it a rather dull place otherwise. It's only excavation has revealed that underneath this rather dull landscape, there's a huge amount of material there of substantial buildings. But although it's ostensibly a protected site, most of this land is owned by the Department of Antiquities. Buildings are starting to creep in. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, and they're coming around here. Every year we go, there seems to be a new building sort of eaten in. And you go back the next year and you find that they've not only eaten in now, but they've extended the garden a few more metres. So the site is disappearing, and the Department of Antiquities seems to be helpless to do anything about it. Too many people with vested interests in a region where land prices would make people in Perth weep if you could get such prices here. Land prices are very, very high in Jordan. There's every incentive to ignore the fines that would be imposed for breaching the rules. It's right beside the Roman road as well. The Roman road is there. You can still find milestones lying around it. There's a man there, and Yadjuz is just off the picture here. But this too is rapidly disappearing. You see that huge earthworks taking place there. Part of the road's already disappeared. It's not going to be long before this bit's gone as well. But for the moment, we've got Yadjuz. There's roughly the area in which the town survives, so about 20 hectares, as I say. But all these buildings being cut in. This is one that we saw back in October, where they were putting down the foundations. And when you walk around inside there, the sections are about 3 metres high, 4 metres high. You can see that they've already cut through walls. That there had been something there that had not been investigated. And probably next year when we go back, they'll have moved a bit further down the hill still towards where excavation has taken place. Rebecca drew this very useful map superimposed on a Google Earth image of the buildings that have been excavated so far. There's at least 3 churches, lots of very fine architectural pieces associated with them. All of them have got fine mosaics laid down on them, marble chancel screens, extensive residential area as well. Some of the houses have been excavated rather unusually, and there's a lot of evidence for them processing grapes and olives on the site. So a rare example of what a village town in the vicinity of Amman, of Philadelphia, would have looked like. Here's one where sadly the evidence has disappeared. This is a place called Sumak. I've called it south because there's another one of the same name not very far away to the north. There's a man there. It is down here. This is Condor's map. You can see something of the quality of his map based on all that triangulation. And it's on a major roadway from Amman. This is a map of 1881. Warren had been there before Condor. He was there in 1867. And he says, we continued up the Wadi till 9:22. He's always very precise here, the times they stop, start, everything they do. Continued up the Wadi till 9:22. When we came to Samak, there's always problems with spelling. You have to remember that they got the names of places from their Arab guides. Their Arab guides were illiterate, and their Arab guides might come from different tribes who had different dialects as well, so that they would write down what they thought they had been told. And it depended on whether it was somebody who was an English speaker writing it down, or a German speaker or a French speaker, they would spell it in different ways as well, different conventions. So there's always problems trying to determine whether this name is the same as that slightly similar looking one. A hill on which there are most extensive ruins, all in confusion. Here are columns, pedestals, and capitals lumbering the ground, and no idea of the ground plan of the temples or public buildings of which they form part could be obtained during the short time we were able to examine it. Some of the capitals are Corinthian, in other words, it's a Roman site. There are a great many pilasters about, and the pedestals appear to be peculiar to this country, etc., etc. A very large pedestal of the same kind has been lately dug up in the convent of the Sisters of Sion at Jerusalem and is now to be seen in the chapel attached to that establishment. So they've identified what they've seen in regard as a Roman site. They say it's very big, but because of the sheer jumble of material there, they can't make any great sense of it. But there are plenty of substantial buildings there. You know, there are columns and there's column capitals and so on. So it's not just a small residential village. Northey was there just a few years later. Warden had been there 1867, this is 1871. He says the same sort of thing. I won't read through it because his principal contribution is to emphasize that A, it's, as far as he's concerned, it's a Roman site, and B, that in one direction, unfortunately he only gives us the dimension in one direction, he says that it extends for about 400 yards. So even if it's quite narrow, because it appears to be on the top of a ridge, if you allow 100 metres wide by 400 yards long, you're dealing with somewhere that's quite substantial. What's that, about 10 hectares, something of that sort? 4 hectares. Conda was there in 1881. He presumably felt that these others had already said everything they need to say, but he too is convinced it's a Roman or Byzantine town. But the plans of the buildings could not be made out, and he didn't stop to plan anything, unfortunately. The two Germans, Bruno and von Domaszewski, that I mentioned before, when they passed by, they evidently felt that it had all been done before, so they went through rather rapidly, and despite the fact that they would have been just the people to do this meticulous work, and who were taking hundreds of photographs, they passed by simply noting the name, but made no other records. So we got this quite substantial place there, according to 19th century sources, but we've only got written words to tell us what it looked like and what its size may have been, give us some idea of its character. It's, again, probably somewhere like the Jews, a large village, maybe a small town would be the appropriate term. Fast forward almost 100 years from when these people saw it, and we've got two American surveys. Won't read them. They essentially say there was virtually nothing to be seen there 100 years later, and what we could see appeared to be early Islamic in date, the bits and pieces we saw. So, in other words, virtually everything that had been seen in the 19th century by those travellers had disappeared, and if we had to rely on the 1970s, 1980s surveys, we'd learn very little. We wouldn't get much of an impression of this place at all. So, it's useful to be able to, immensely useful to be able to go back to the 19th century visitors. There's what the area looks like now. You can see it's almost completely built over. Here's the major highway down to the airport. This is in 2015, so it's 2014, so it's a very recent Google Earth image. There's still areas of open there, but by and large the site has disappeared. I'm not entirely sure even where it is. Depends on who you read. It may be up there or it may be down here, but either way it's gone. Or there may be fragments, or you may be able to learn something by looking at old aerial photographs. This is one of 1953, and this is probably what it looked like at that time. A modern farm has been built on top of the hill, but you can see that the ground has all been churned up, and there's remains of what are presumably ancient structures tumbled to the north and to the south of the modern farm. What was the roundabout? I mean, this is what the town and the village looked like at Sumac. Warden, however, was absolutely stunned by what he saw when he got there. He doesn't just describe the village. He says, we've now arrived at a very remarkable piece of country. Over a tract of 4 miles square, not quite sure what 4 miles square means, there is a never-ending succession of ruins. On each spur there appears to have been a village. On each hilltop a temple or public building. In 1 square mile I have shown 6 of these on the plan, but I could not put a fifth of them in. They seem to turn up in every direction. This tract appears to be more like one large town than anything else, and yet there is at present very little water here. It is, however, a portion which most decidedly merits a more lengthened visit than I was able to afford it. for in names alone is most rich. In other words, the Bedouin guides were able to give names to every hill, suggesting that they were familiar with this area. It does not appear that this part has been visited by any European before. A great portion of the masonry is no doubt Roman, but there's a good deal which appears to be older. So not only is Sumac itself a substantial place, but he says that every hilltop round about here seems to have a village or ruins or temples or something on top of it. But as you saw from that previous image, it's all largely gone now. Now, I've taken longer than I planned to get this far, so I will rapidly move on to one that I was working on just over the last 2 or 3 days. I put this one in because it's 2 sites that were mentioned by 19th century travellers, but seem to have been completely lost since then. They don't figure in the Jordanian Department of Antiquities database. They've never heard of them. And yet, in the 19th century, people were aware that something quite substantial was there, and they wrote about it. The 2 sites are close together, as you can see from Condor's map. There's the southern one there, it's called Rujum Tahin, and then just to the north of the wadi, there's another ruin there. That's what the letter R implies. It's a ruin, place of almost the same name. They used this as a triangulation point. Hence he's put a little triangle there. It's not just a hill, but a conical hill, but it's where they had one of their triangulation points for their mapping. They say that at the ruins at the north there were traces of buildings which they thought to be Roman or Byzantine in date. There were lots of well-cut large stones scattered across the site. Trying to pin it down today is tricky. I think this is it probably here, with the northern one up there, and the wadi's disappeared in between. But there, it's the terracing on the hills that it gives it away, as we'll see in a moment when we look at an old aerial photograph. But as you can see, this whole area where these 2 sites were has largely disappeared under houses and development. Fortunately, 2 French priests passed by, and these 2 men, Jausen and Savignac, and they were waiting for a train. They were interested in the antiquities anyway, but they had to wait for a train at the nearby railway station, so they had till the end of the following day, so they went off and explored. And the landscape was still fairly empty. What they saw when they went to this place was what they identified as a church. They said that they could see the apse of the church, and they recorded this lintel piece which included a cross on it. They said nearby there was the lid of a sarcophagus, implying that there was a cemetery nearby as well. And they said when they went down to the far end of the hill, they could see that there were a number of monumental tombs cut into the hillside, so there's a large cemetery nearby. It seems all now to be gone. I'll skip forward rapidly. There's what I think is one of the sites there. There's the terracing, very distinctive terracing. And here's those 2 sites as it appears on a photograph of 1953. And you can see there's one of them there, and the remains of the other one there. And that, I think, is that. So it's disappearing, but you can still make it out. As I say, I focused on these 2 because they're relatively close to the centre of Amman, so you would have thought they were prime for destruction. Second, neither of them appears in the Jordanian database. They don't know their existence. So this isn't unusual. The database has, I think, about 8,500 sites on it, whereas from aerial photographs we've identified about 25,000 sites, 3 times as many. So they simply don't know everything they have, and they don't have the resources to find out what they have. They seem to be quite clear that it was a church, and the evidence points to that, and yet the most recent book on churches in Jordan, Roman churches in Jordan, published this in 2001, knows nothing about this. The French scholar who wrote the book has not gone back and looked at what the French priests were writing 100 years ago. That sort of thing happens all the time. We can get an enormous amount of information by simply going and looking at what 19th century travellers had to say as they went through this landscape. I'm going to call this to a halt within a couple of minutes now. I was going to talk about Abdun here, which is one of the name is synonymous in Amman with wealthy living. It's where most of the big embassies are, the American embassy and now the Australian embassy as well. It's where there's lots of pavement cafes, nightclubs, and if you wander around at night, you'll find that all the young Arabs sitting in the cafes on the pavement are all talking to each other in better English than I can usually manage. 50 years ago, it was just open hillsides. There's virtually nothing there except the ruins. Now, as you can see, it's densely built over, and it's got this marvellous bridge they're very fond of. It's an S-shaped bridge that goes in an S as it crosses the body there. The remains of the ancient sites have all disappeared, almost all disappeared. There are a few hints. That would have been the heart of Abdoon in ancient times. The US embassies there, the Australian embassies down here. And visitors to it back in the 19th century give us the evidence. I don't have time to run through it, but take my word for it that these 19th century sources again point to things that were there until maybe 50, 60 years ago, which have now been completely destroyed, and at the time very little effort was made to record anything of them, sometimes just the name but without any details. They're there on Condor's map. There's Abdoon here, and he travelled in from up here. He came from where there's a church at Swifia. He went past this ruin here, down to Abdoon where he marks another ruin. He's marked a ruin there, there, there. So he saw ruins all over this hillside as he went along. Virtually all of it's disappeared. That's the route he was taking. And in addition to the 19th century sources and Condor's map, we've got these marvellous maps done by the German army in 1918. Very accurate and showing what the landscape looked like in 1918. Fortunately, they've all been digitized now, so you can see them all very easily on your computer, and you can overlay them on Google Earth and sort of line things up. Or at least Travis can. I don't do it. And there's what it looked like in 1953. You can see that Abdoon has not yet become the place to be. There's the remains of the ancient settlement up there. See this little rectangle there? There's another structure in there. But it's all this as well. It's all the fields round about, fossilized fields that are interesting. They've all disappeared too. And then the American expedition came along in 1904, and they found a whole string of tombs cut into the hillside up here, monumental tombs that go down a staircase, and there's lochily for sarcophagi all around the sides. There's one of the tombs that they recorded there. They too have all now been destroyed by the new highway cutting through just to the north. And then, quite by chance, one of these highways turned this place up. Right beside the road, there's the highway here, and this aerial photograph we took a few years ago. It was originally identified as a farm, and it was for the processing of grapes and olives. We've got some of the mills for the olives there. And here's the back with the great wheel for crushing the olives, and then there's the two columns of a vertical press. There would have been a screw press in the middle here. And underneath all of this are great vats into which the juice ran after the processing. It's not just a farm, however, because the excavators thought that just over here, in an area they didn't excavate, they found the remains of a church. So the probability is that you're dealing with somewhere that was a monastery, which is functioning as a farm. And the date on it is provided by the discovery of, I think it was about 82 late Byzantine gold coins, suggesting that it belongs to the 6th century AD. I think I've just about reached the end. Yes, I better stop on that since I've already gone on for an hour. What I want to say, just by way of summing up, is that it's the 150th anniversary of the Palestine Exploration Fund that sent out Warren and then Condor, who did such marvellous work in the 19th century. Essentially, we need a new expedition to go out. It can't be sent by the Palestine Exploration Fund, which lives in a rather Dickensian building up a side street in Marylebone, and you can scarcely afford the instant coffee if you visit them. But the foreign countries, the Germans, the British, French, Americans, all of whom have archaeological institutes in Jordan, they need to tackle something like this, that the archaeological remains in the immediate hinterland of Philadelphia, Amman, are being destroyed very rapidly. There are still material there that can be salvaged. Rather surprisingly, even in the most unlikely spots, you find tucked away in people's gardens things that you would have thought were now gone, but they're still there. But they've never been recorded. It needs a new expedition to try and salvage this, the kind of thing that Fawzi Zaidin was advocating back in that text I quoted from 1980, but which never really took off. It's not quite too late yet, but another 10 years, and the chances are that Amman will have sprawled even further, and what has survived up to today will have disappeared. The starting point, however, is simply to go back and quarry your way through all the 19th century written sources and maps and photographs and diagrams. There's a huge amount there that has never made its way into the Jordanian database. They've got a very sophisticated database now, provided for them at huge expense by the Getty Foundation in California, but it is absolutely riddled with errors, and nobody has the incentive to correct them or to fill in the details. I mean, every time we look at a record on it, I can see that there's things missing, there's things wrong with it, but it requires people who actually know the country to work on it and do something about it. Without that, these sites will continue to be destroyed. Okay, it's tea time. Thank you for bearing with me for longer than I'd planned.